Okay, now let's talk about HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. So where does JavaScript go in relation to HTML and CSS? Well, if you imagine HTML, CSS, and JavaScript as being different layers of the web development process or different layers of the web page itself, then you can visualize these three languages somewhat like this. At the very bottom, we have HTML, because HTML is the foundation of a web page or web application. HTML, or hypertext markup language, is what defines the structure and basic content of a web page. So that goes at the very bottom, because the development of a web page usually starts with HTML, because HTML defines the fundamental structure of a web page, and that is what we start the development with. So for a website, the development usually starts at HTML, because that defines the basic structure. And then on top of that, you have CSS, or cascading style sheets. CSS is used to style the web pages. Specifically, CSS can be used to add style and change the appearance of the default HTML elements, which means CSS sits on top of HTML, because after you've defined the HTML, then you can go ahead and define the CSS styles for the different HTML elements. And that's why at the bottom we have HTML, and then on top of that we have CSS. And on top of that, we have JavaScript, because JavaScript is a programming language or a scripting language, and this language can be used to add dynamic behavior and interactivity to any web page or web application. So a web page that is otherwise static, using JavaScript, you can make it dynamic and interactive. And this sits on top of HTML and CSS. And that's because when JavaScript is usually used on the front end or the client side, one of its biggest jobs is to manipulate HTML and CSS. That's one of the most common things JavaScript does on a web page. So you can think of JavaScript as sitting on top of HTML and CSS. Because usually, after you've defined the HTML and CSS, then you can work with JavaScript. And you can use this JavaScript to manipulate HTML and CSS and add dynamic behavior and logic to your web application. So if you think of HTML, CSS, and JavaScript as being different layers of the web, then you can think of HTML as being at the very bottom, defining the very fundamental structure of a web page. Then we have CSS on the middle, which defines the structure, which goes on top of HTML. And then on top of that, we have JavaScript, which defines the dynamic behavior and logic for a web page. And that's how we have HTML, CSS, and JavaScript stacked on top of one another. Now, what does JavaScript look like? Like, we've been talking about JavaScript for a long time, but we haven't actually seen much JavaScript code. So it's time that we actually take a look at what JavaScript looks like, what the syntax looks like, and how JavaScript looks when you actually write it out. So in order to show you how the programming language JavaScript looks in real life, let's create a very simple web application that can be used to illustrate how JavaScript code looks and also show some usage of JavaScript in real life. We will start with some HTML. So first we will have an HTML h1 tag which says say hello. So we basically have an h1 tag which is the first heading in HTML with the text say hello and then an exclamation mark. Then we'll have an input element. Now the input tag in HTML can be used to create a form field where the user can enter text or other data. So in this case we'll create an input tag and we'll specify the type attribute as text. So the type will be text, and we'll also define the placeholder attribute which will contain the text enter your name here. So this is an input field where users can input their names. Then we'll create a button element. So we'll create a button tag with the text say hi and an exclamation mark. So we just create a button tag with the text say hi. And finally, for the HTML, we will create an h2 tag. The h2 tag in HTML is used to create a second level heading. Now in our case, the h2 tag will be empty. It doesn't contain any text. So when you load up the web page, this h2 tag won't be visible at first. However, we will populate this h2 tag with text using JavaScript. So we'll have an empty h2 tag for now. And now it's time to write our JavaScript. Now inside HTML, you can write JavaScript using script tags. You can put the JavaScript code inside a pair of script tags. So in this case, we'll write our opening script tag, and then we'll write our JavaScript, and then we'll finish it up with the ending script tag. So we have our opening script tag here, and now it's time to write some JavaScript. So what will we write here exactly? We will define some code such as document.querySelector button.addEventListener click, and then we'll define a function where we create a variable called name and then assign it the value document.querySelector_input.value.trim or the string world. And finally, we select the h2 tag using document.querySelector_h2.textContent and set it to hello plus name plus an exclamation symbol. And then we finish off the function and also the addEventListener method. And then finally, we wrap everything up with the ending script tag. So this is the JavaScript that we have written for this application. But what does this JavaScript actually do? In order to find that out, let's actually take this code and execute it inside a browser and test it out. Okay, so here we have the HTML and JavaScript code that we just saw saved inside a file named index.html and loaded inside a browser. So on the left hand side, as you can see, we have a file named index.html loaded locally from the computer. So on the left side here, as you can see, we have a browser, Google Chrome in this case, inside which we've actually opened and loaded up the index.html file, as you can see from the URL bar right here. And on the right hand side, we have our code editor. In this case, we're using Atom. And with Atom, we have opened up the index.html file and we can edit the code here. So first, in the HTML file, we have some basic HTML code such as the document type, defining HTML, meaning it's an HTML5 document. Then we have the HTML tag, then the head tag, and inside the head tag, we have defined the character set UTF-8, and then we also have the title tag that says JavaScript practice. And then inside the body tag is where we actually have the code that we just saw, the HTML and JavaScript code that we just saw a few moments ago. So here we have the h1 tag again that says say hello, then the input tag with type text and placeholder enter your name here, then the button tag that says say hi, and then an empty h2 tag. And then we have the script tag with our 4 lines of JavaScript code like we have here. So here inside Atom, we have written all this code and saved it in a file on our computer named index.html. And we have loaded the same file inside our browser here. So as you can see in the browser, we can see the HTML. We have the h1 tag that says say hello, the input form element that says enter your name here, and also a button tag that says say hi. So what does this actually do? Well, in order to test the code out, let's actually input our name here. So in this case, I'm going to input my name, Abrar, and then after entering my name, if I click on the say hi button right here, as you can see, it greets me by my name by saying hello Abrar. So basically what this code does is that it takes the user input from the input field and greets the user by that name. So basically whatever you enter here, if you enter 123 here for example, and then click on the say hi button, it greets you by that name, hello 123. What's even more interesting is that if you leave this input field blank or just put spaces there and then click on the say hi button, then it defaults to the string world. So it says hello world in case you haven't inputted anything valid inside the input field. So it defaults to hello world. But otherwise, it just greets you by whatever name you just input in the input field. So using just a bit of HTML and JavaScript, we've created a cool little greeting application. Nice, right? Okay, so let's get back to where we were. So in this case, this is what JavaScript actually looks like. Now one thing to remember here is that we're using some pretty advanced level JavaScript code for this example. So we're using a lot of properties and methods and a lot of things that you might not be familiar with. For example, you might not know what variables are or how logical operators work. But don't worry, you don't have to understand this code. This code isn't meant to be understood at this point. This was just a cool example to show you how JavaScript actually looks like and how it appears on the web page. So if you don't understand this code now, no need to worry. As we go through this course together, we will eventually understand everything that's going on here. We will understand what variables are, what logical operators are, how functions and methods work, and all that kind of stuff. For now, just know that this is how JavaScript looks in real life. Now, if you're really interested as to what's actually going on here, here's a brief description. First, we have document.querySelector button. Using the querySelector method of the document object, we're basically selecting the HTML button element. Then we have .addEventListener, click, and a function. Basically, we're adding an event listener for the click event and also defining a function that should be executed when the event occurs. Basically, we're telling JavaScript that this is what you need to do when the button element is clicked by the user. And then inside the function, we declare a variable called name. And we assign it the value document.querySelector.input.value.trim. This basically selects the input HTML tag and selects the value and trims any white spaces out. And then it assigns this value to the variable called name, or if this value is not truthy, it defaults to the string world. And then finally, we have document.querySelector_h2.textContent, which basically selects the m2h2 tag that we have in our HTML, and it adds some text inside it. Specifically, it has a string hello concatenated with the name the user has inputted in the input field, so it can be used to greet the user by the name. And this is what this JavaScript code actually does. But again, you don't have to understand every bit of this right now because we will eventually talk about all of this later on in this course.